Hey everyone, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So today we're going to look at the PocketGo S30 Retro Handheld Gaming Console. Now this device just came out, it actually just started shipping yesterday, but I was lucky enough to get a prototype copy about a month ago from RetroMimi.com, and this is the retail unit that I'll be reviewing today. So let's get to it. Okay, so what's inside this device? Number one, it has a quad-core 1.2 GHz all-winner A33 chipset, which includes a Mali 400 MP2 graphics chip and 512 megs of RAM. It has a 3.5-inch IPS LCD display, but it is not a laminated screen like you would find on the RG351P or the RG350M or any of those devices. It has a 480 by 320 screen resolution, which results in a 3:2 aspect ratio, the same you would find on the RG351. And finally, it has a 2600 mAh battery, which is supposed to last about 4 to 5 hours, and I think 4 hours is about right. Now, one of the most appealing things about this device is its price. It's only $60 right now during its initial sale period. And so for $60, we kind of have to look at it differently than we do, for example, the RG351P, which is around $90, $95. Completely different ballgame here. So I'm going to approach this review a little bit differently, given the fact that it is significantly cheaper than a lot of the other flagship handhelds like the RG351 or even the Retroid Pocket 2. So it's not going to compare to those feature-wise, but let's look at whether or not it's worth your $60. And keep in mind that this $60 is just the initial price point. They are saying that it is going to go up to $70 at some point, but we're going to approach it as if it is $60. Alright, so let's do some unboxing here. Now my unit was just covered in like this super hard tape, and so it took me forever to open up. Yours isn't going to have this, but I thought it just was a little amusing how much work I had to do to get the thing out first. So here we are. The box is pretty simple. You know, honestly, it's got a picture on the front, it's got a little bit of text on the back, but other than that, there really isn't much to it. Inside you see we have about a 6-inch USB-C cable and then a instruction manual which really doesn't have any information in it. It's in Chinese and in English. Okay, so right off the bat, you can see that the screen is not laminated. There's a little bit of a gap between the glass on the front and then the LCD panel itself. These buttons feel pretty good. They're pretty small, a lot like the other retro handhelds, you know. I wish they were a little bit bigger, but they have a nice feel to them. You know, they click a little bit without being clicky. They mush a little bit without being mushy. I think they're well balanced. The analog stick is just the same that you find in a lot of these other retro handheld devices. It's basically a switch analog stick. The D-pad is responsive. It's a little bit small, a little bit hard, but we'll get into that here in a minute. Now these stacked shoulder buttons are probably one of the most appealing things to people. You know, the L1 button just goes straight down, but the L2 is kind of on a hinge. If you look here, when I push down on it, it looks like it just goes straight down, but if you look at it from the side, it kind of pulls back. And what I found from this is when you push down on it, it actually isn't responsive when it comes back up. So often you push the button and then you're not sure the second time around whether or not you're pushing it correctly. Up top you have a power button, a USB-C port for charging, and then a volume up and down. On the bottom you can see there's some indicator lights, a headphone jack, and then an SD card slot. And over here you see there's a single slot for the speaker. Now there's a mono speaker in here and there's no other hole for it. So honestly, the sound kind of emanates from the right side of the device overall. This slot really doesn't do much. You actually get more sound out of the shoulder buttons than you do anything, which is kind of odd. Mine came with a 16GB micro SD card. It says SanDisk on the front. I'm not sure if it actually is a SanDisk. You can see the font is a different color than the rest of it. So I don't know whether or not this is just a generic card that they put that logo on or if it actually is a SanDisk. Who knows? On the back you can see it just has the PocketGo logo there. I do like that there is very little branding on this device. So this device is obviously modeled after the original Super Nintendo controller, so let's actually look at one of those controllers for comparison. You can see here the Super Nintendo controller is a bit smaller than the other one. And one of the things I want to point out is the texture on the gamepad itself. You can see here on the Super Nintendo pad, it has a lot of grit and texture to it, even on the D-pad itself. By comparison, this one has a little bit of texture to it, but nothing compared to like that Super Nintendo one, which is almost like sandpaper comparably. And I really like the grit that's on the Super Nintendo one. I think it's a huge bonus, and it's a missed opportunity that there is not a lot of grit on this controller also. You can see the buttons are much smaller, and I wish the A and B buttons were dark purple like this one. Now, one of the things that kind of bothers me about the S30 is that the top buttons are supposed to be concave. They're supposed to go in a little bit, like a little bit of a valley. And then the A and B buttons on the Super Nintendo controller are convex. On this device, all of them are convex, and they're all the same color, and I just think it's kind of a design flaw that could have made this look and feel a lot better. Same thing with the select and start buttons. You can see on the Super Nintendo controller, they're basically flush with the rest of the controller. They stick out about the same amount, but on the S30, they're much higher. And you can see here, I have a feeling that they're going to catch on things. You try to slide this in and out of your pocket, these start and select buttons are going to get caught in your pocket. Now, one other big thing about the Super Nintendo controller is just how great it feels in the hands, right? You can really grip this thing and kind of wrap your hands around it, and it feels very comfortable. This is a very classic, iconic design here. Now, unfortunately, that's kind of impossible with the S30. One, the screen kind of gets in the way of your index finger, so you're not able to grip it really well. But on top of that, the D-pad and the buttons are spread out more. They're more towards the edge of the device, which means you kind of have to hold this thing with your fingertips as opposed to gripping it like you would with the Super Nintendo controller. It's just not very ergonomically designed like it is with the original. Okay, this video is coming out the day after Christmas, and for Christmas my family actually got me this 8BitDo controller here. And I've heard that the 8BitDo team actually helped design the S30, and so that's probably why they're very similar, and so I thought it'd be a good opportunity to just kind of show off everything. You can see this controller has a plastic shell on the front of it, much like the S30 console. So right off the bat, you can see that the SN30 is much smaller. It's about the size of an actual Super Nintendo controller, and they have that same stacked shoulder button design, but it's a little bit better implemented in the 8BitDo controller. You can see with the S30, there's a gap when you push down on it, and I'm a little worried that dust or something is going to get in there as you're pushing it, because it really leaves a pretty big open gap, and if you're playing games for a long time, that might become a problem over time. Also, I think the shoulder button on the 8BitDo controller is a little bit more springy. It feels a little bit better in the hands compared to this S30, which is just kind of mushy, and it's really hard to feel when you're pushing down on it. And 8BitDo got the face buttons right. They're much larger, and then the top ones are concave, whereas the bottom ones are convex. Now, the analog sticks are a little bit weirder. They're much higher up, and they kind of have this weird ball design to them, but the D-pad they also got right. It has texture to it, it's larger and a little bit softer like the Super Nintendo controller. Whereas with the S30 controller, it's much harder and smaller and kind of slippery feeling. Okay, so let's power this on and see what it actually looks like. So it's really simple here. You can see the menu is literally just pictures, and you can just kind of tab through all of them for your different systems. There's no frills, there's no video or any animations or anything else like that. The settings, literally you can just change it from English to Chinese, and you can change your backlighting, and that's it. This is a very, very bare bones system. And honestly, it's a little bit appealing to me. You know, the fact that this is so simple, you can just hand it off to somebody, and you just flip through your system, pick your game, and then there you go. So let's start up a game here. You just hit A to get to the menu, and then you just hit A again to start up the actual game. Now, right off the bat, I can see there are some graphics issues here. Not only does it have the typical pixelation issues that comes from a 3x2 480x320 display, but this looks very, very fuzzy to me. I think that there's something even worse going on with these emulators. I don't think the emulators are graphically optimized for this display in particular. Now, hopefully somebody can fix this down the line, but if you look in the video settings, it's very, very bare bones. All you can do is just pick a couple different settings, and all of them look pretty terrible. Honestly, none of these take advantage of the actual display here. So when you pull up a retro game and you look at the graphics itself, it looks much worse than it should be. And we'll get into a comparison here in a minute, but as it stands, this looks really fuzzy. And if you've ever played any of these retro consoles before, you're going to immediately be able to tell how bad this display is. The graphics are just not optimized for this device. You can see here with Contra, it has the same problem. And I think the issue is even more prominent on 16-bit consoles. For example, here with the Super Nintendo, you can see the turtle just looks really fuzzy and weirdly pixelated. Whereas if you take the RG351P here, which is using RGA scaling, you can actually see the whites of Leonardo's eyes here. And that's something you cannot see on the other one. It just looks kind of blurry and mushy. Not only that, the white balance is off. You can see that it's much more yellow and green of a display than it is on the 351p. And I'm not saying the 351p is the flagship display or anything, but it does look pretty bad. And honestly, if this was the only console you had, it probably wouldn't make much of a difference to you, but when you compare it to something else, you can see it immediately. And you know, the viewing angles on the S30 are not great. You can see with the 351p, because it's a laminated screen, everything looks really nice and crisp. But here with the S30, you can see that there's a gap there between the glass and the LCD display itself, and that makes it so you don't have very good viewing angles. But again, you're talking about a device that costs 2/3 the price of the RG351P, so there's going to be some concessions there. So let's take another budget handheld device. Here's the RGB10 here. And one of the things I want to show right off the bat here with the 351P, you can see that the pixelation looks really good with RGA scaling. And then you have kind of this bad pixelation that you have with the S30 here. Everything looks fuzzy and just kind of not accurate. And then here with the RGB10, this also has RGA scaling on it, but the RGB10 screen is much more yellow. It has even more white balance issues. So in this sense, the PocketGo is actually a better console when it comes to white balance. You can see this has a very yellow screen, but its pixelation is pretty good. And then on the S30, the yellow is still there and the pixelation is even worse. And if this is the only console you have, maybe that white balance won't be an issue. You know, you're just going to get used to whatever screen you're looking at. And the RGB10, I think it's very prominent and very annoying, but I think with the S30, you can probably get away with it. Now, I don't want to belabor this point too much, but to me, this pixelation issue is a big deal. These emulators are not optimized for the screen, and you can just tell here, with the 351p, everything looks sharp and crisp. All those little details with Leonardo, like his belt and his eyeballs and everything else, you just cannot see them on the S30. Now my hope is that some developer out there is able to fix a lot of these pixelation issues and optimize these emulators, but as it stands out of the box, it is definitely a compromised experience. But you know, the gameplay experience is not terrible. Everything feels pretty good here. Now, unfortunately, that mono speaker really does feel kind of tinny and not very nice, but overall, you know, you can get in and you can play your Super Nintendo games, and that's what this is designed for. Now, the graphical issues are not limited to just home consoles. You can see here with the Game Boy, it still has its own issues here. We're using a 1.5 scaling right here, and it still has a lot of that pixelation issues. You can just see in the menu, nothing looks very sharp, and that's kind of an indication that this is not optimized. And if I pull up one-time scaling, which should look perfect on a device, it still has these issues. You can see the text is all weird looking, Mario has got some weird pixelation going on. It's just not ideal. And even playing it at full screen, there are still some ghosting issues that you may not see on the camera here, but it just has some weird pixelation with Mario as well. So here's another weird one. This Game Boy Advance emulator is not optimized either. You can see its letterbox. It's a 3:2 display, which is the perfect aspect ratio for the Game Boy Advance, but somehow they screwed this one up as well. You can go in the settings and make it full screen, but it still looks really weird, like washed out, and the text is not sharp. Everything looks just kind of muddied and degraded. Especially because with the 3:2 aspect ratio, you should expect it to play Game Boy Advance games perfectly. Here's the 351p again. You can see the outlining of your character just is a little bit more sharp, and everything just looks rendered perfectly. One of the easiest ways to see this issue is if you look at the text itself. That 320 just kind of has like this kind of unfocused look to it, whereas the 320 is super sharp on the 351p. Now, paradoxically, there is a second Game Boy Advance emulator on here, and it actually runs just fine. So I would just say avoid the GPSP emulator and use the MGBA one because everything looks good on this one. Now, Pico Drive is also installed on this device, which allows you to pull up any number of Genesis systems, but this is a good time to bring up the fact that the folder system inside the SD card itself is not written correctly. So for example, there's a Genesis folder, so you can put your Genesis games in there, but there's no Sega CD folder or 32X or Master System, which should all play on Pico Drive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a setup guide for this later on, and I'll show you how to add all that stuff. I'm not going to do it here in this review, but just look for that in the next week or so, it'll come out. Now the system will also play PC Engine or TurboGrafx 16 games, and this has the same pixelation issues you find in both the Genesis and Super Nintendo. It just kind of looks a little weird. Now one bright spot is the PlayStation emulation. It actually looks pretty good on this device. The pixels and everything else look nice and smooth. Overall, I tested it with several games and everything looked nice and played pretty well. But honestly, playing Capcom vs SNK here was the first time I really noticed that the D-pad is not up to snuff when it comes to fighting games at all, which is unfortunate because I used to love playing fighting games on the old SNES. PSP emulation is pretty good. You actually have full access to PPSSPP, which means that you can go in and really tweak the settings. You can see here I have it at 2x resolution, and it looks pretty good with this game. But obviously you're not going to be able to play like big time 3D games on this, but you will be able to focus on 2D games and things that are not quite as intense. Now unfortunately Dreamcast is just terrible on this. They defaulted the resolution to 320 by 240, which looks really terrible. Like it looks like a Super Nintendo game as opposed to a Dreamcast game. It's the way it should look. And I understand why they chose to use the low resolution, because they were trying to get at least some adequate performance. And there's a weird bug when it comes to the controls as well. The analog stick is not very responsive. When I push up on it, sometimes it doesn't work very well at all. But just focus here on Sonic's sprite here. You can see just how terrible it looks. Look at how pixelated everything is. It's kind of unplayable to me. And you may have noticed, but there's no Nintendo 64 emulation on this device. I think it's just because of the CPU, it just can't handle it. Luckily, arcade looks pretty good. You can see here with the MAME emulator, things are looking pretty nice and sharp. Unfortunately, the audio crackles when you play this MAME 2003 emulator, but overall, the graphics look pretty good. But if you're a stickler for good audio, this is not the device for you. Final Burn Alpha also looks nice and sharp, but you can see here after just one round of playing, my thumb was already sore. I was starting to feel it already. And sure, you could probably play this game using an analog stick, but you know, for me, I like to play my fighting games with a D-pad, and unfortunately, this isn't going to work for me. Again, going back to this D-pad issue here, the Super Nintendo controller is larger and grittier, which allows you to just kind of slide your finger across, and it feels very natural. The S30 has a much harder plastic, and it's slick, and it's small, and the combination of all three of these traits does not bode well for any games where you're going to be sliding across or doing any diagonals. Okay, getting into the SD card here, you can see that it's actually just one big fat 32 partition, which means that you can just plug it right into your computer and you can access everything right then and there. So all you have to do is go into the ROMs folder, pull up your various systems, and then just drag and drop your game files, so that's pretty handy. Not only that, I learned that if you keep the SD card in your device and power it on and then plug it into your computer, you can actually access everything as a local host. So you never actually have to take the SD card out. You can just access everything from the device itself, no additional software required. I think that's a very convenient tool. Now, after spending about an hour with the device, I was able to figure out how to change all of the different wallpapers to basically give you a new theme. And so I'm going to set up a starter guide for you here in about a week or so, and I'll walk you through how to do all of this on your device, and I'll probably just make it available to download for you, so you can just throw this onto your own SD card and have this system looking like this. And I also figured out how to use box art and videos with the device as well, so you can just scroll through and pick your game based on the video or the box art or however it is you want to navigate your system. You have that option available to you, and it's actually very easy to set up, and I'll show you how to do that in my next video. Overall, this is one of my favorite things about this device, is how easy it is to customize to your needs. Alright, let's start wrapping up. So let's talk about the things I like about this device first. Number one, I think it's a pretty good design. I like the feel of having this kind of nostalgic Super Nintendo design. I like that there's no branding on the front of it as well, and it has a simple user interface. All you have to do is just tab through your different systems. No other customization is required, but if you want to customize it, it actually is pretty easy to get on the SD card and do that. And like I mentioned, I like the fact that you can access everything via USB. You don't even have to take the SD card out, so I think that's pretty handy. Now, unfortunately, there are some significant cons with this device, so let's go through those next. Number one, some of these emulators are just terrible. Unfortunately, they don't work very well, and Nintendo and Super Nintendo in particular look very bad on this device. I don't like the small D-pad and the small buttons. I wish they were bigger and more similar to the original SNES. I would have been okay with a little bit bigger of a console if that meant I could have bigger buttons and a D-pad. If you're a visual or an audio purist, this device is probably going to bother you because the white balance is kind of annoying, and then on top of that, the sound is not very great. That one mono speaker that doesn't really have room to breathe doesn't sound very good. And the organization of the files themselves are kind of haphazard. If you try to scroll through, it's not going to go Nintendo to Super Nintendo, it's going to be all over the place. And I'll fix that in my upcoming guide, but that's just something to think about. So wrapping things up, who do I think this device is for? Honestly, I think it's a good $60 price point for people who just want to jump into games and don't know anything about emulation, and they just want the ability to play something that's in a form factor that reminds them of their childhood. And from that perspective, this kind of wins in that sense. Now, when it comes down to features, for example, there's no Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or anything else like that. None of that stuff exists on this device. It is very, very bare bones, but if you're into that kind of thing, this might be a good solution for $60. Alright everyone, that's it for this video. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful for you, and keep a lookout for the starter guide which I'll publish in about a week or so, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.